Good morning and welcome to the first full day of our conference on giving, caring for the needs of strangers. We're set for a very interesting morning, and I'm not going to say anything except to introduce our moderator for this morning's session, Richard Bernstein, who is my colleague here at the New School in what used to be called the Graduate Faculty and is now called the New School for Social Research. Dick is the Viralist Professor of Philosophy here at the New School and author of many books. He has a book coming out this spring on violence, Thinking Without Banisters, and is the author of, and I will just let you know a few of the titles, Radical Evil, A Philosophical Interrogation, Freud and the Legacy of Moses, Hannah Arendt and the Jewish Question, The New Constellation, The Ethical Political Horizons of Modernity and Postmodernity, and Philosophical Profiles. And so it is with great pleasure that I turn this over to Dick, and I think we're in for a very interesting morning. Thank you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. Can everybody hear me in the microphone? Yes. Okay. I am Dick Bernstein, and I teach the New School. And I was reflecting. I hope or expect that most of you were here last night. It was really quite extraordinary. Quite extraordinary because, in a world where it's hard not to be cynical and skeptical about what goes on. Here was a remarkable story of a person who had gone through all kinds of suffering, all kinds of misery. He had benefited from strangers and did what we all, I think, have fantasies about, believe that we could make a difference in the world and do something, and really started this remarkable health center in Burundi. So it becomes an exemplar of giving, and today we begin the conference now to reflect on this issue. I have to pay a compliment to the organizer, to Arian, because it seems to me what is always remarkable about Arian is she puts together people on panels that I suspect have never been on a panel together. It's rare that you're ever going to get people who are authorities in such different fields speaking to a kind of common issue. So I think that we're in for a feast of talk. I just want to give, I think the way we will run things, my main function is to be timekeeper, but I'd like to introduce each of the speakers. I think the most intelligent way to proceed is I will give the introductions and then we will just start the papers, and at the end we will have hopefully some time for discussion where you can raise issues for anyone. I will remind you then that there are microphones here and to speak up if you have questions. So we're going to do it simply in the order in which people are sitting here. Our first speaker is J. Brian Hare, who is a Parker Gilbert Montgomery Professor, Practice of Religion and Public Life, and he's also Secretary of Healthcare and Social Services for the Archdiocese of Boston. And his research and writing focus on ethics, foreign policy, and the role of religion in world politics in American society. He was a faculty member of Georgetown University and the Harvard Divinity School, and his writings include chapters on the moral measurement of war on intervention in national sovereignty, Catholicism, democracy, social values, and public policy, and a contribution to a former religious tradition, as well as Catholic Charities USA, 100 Years in the Intersection of Charity and Justice. And his theme is a small theme, the Judeo-Christian tradition. Okay. And the second speaker will be Amy Singer, and although we have two singers who are on the piano, they are not related, and I believe that they met only for the first time this morning. Is that correct? Okay. Amy Singer is a professor of Ottoman history in the Department of Middle Eastern and African Studies at Tel Aviv University, Israel, and she's the author of Charity in Islamic Societies, Constructing Ottoman Beneficiaries, Poverty and Charity in the Middle Eastern Context, and Palestine peasants and the Ottoman officials, and feeding people, feeding power, and Emirates in the Ottoman Empire. And the third speaker will be Diana Eck, who is a professor of comparative religion and Indian studies, and the Frederick Wetham Professor of Law and Psychiatry and Society, and a member of the faculty of the Divinity School of Harvard Divinity School. And Professor Eck's academic work has a dual focus on both India and America, and her work on India focuses on popular religion, especially temples and places of pilgrimage. Her work in the U.S. focuses especially on the challenges of religious pluralism in a multi-religious society. And her books include her most recent work, India, A Sacred Geography, Benares, City of Light at Dawson, Seeing the Divine Image in India, A New Religious America, How a Christian Country Has Become the World's Most Religiously Diverse Nation. And Professor Eck received the National Humanities Award from President Clinton, very distinguished award, and the National Endowment for Humanities in 1998, the Montana's Governor's Humanities Award in 2003, and the Mechler Lifetime Achievement Award from the Unitarian Universe Association in 2003, and in 2005 or 2006, she served as president of the American Academy of Religion. In 2009, Professor Eck delivered the Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh. Okay, and the final her topic, I should have mentioned that Amy's topic is going to be charity in Islamic societies, and the topic of the third speaker is the gift, Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain perspectives. And the last speaker is Peter Singer, who is, there are many things that could be said about Peter Singer, who is the Ira DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at the University Center of Human Values at Princeton, a position he's held since 1999, and he's also the Laureate Professor of Center of Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at the University of Melbourne. And Singer was a founding president of the International Association of Bioethics, and with Helga Cruz, the founding editor of the Journal of Bioethics, and he teaches practical ethics, which he defines as the application of morality to practical problems based on philosophical thinking, rather than on religious beliefs. And in 2009, Singer was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world, and Professor rare for a philosopher. But Professor Singer first became well known internationally after the publication of Animal Liberation in 1975, for giving the impetus to the animal rights movement, and has authored many books, and books including The Way We Eat, Why Our Food Choices Matter. He wrote this with other people, and the President of Good and Evil, a book that I've even quoted, The Ethics of George W. Bush, and Practical Ethics, which was just republished by Cambridge University Press. So it's a very impressive list, and I think we all look forward to what they have to say. So we will begin. Okay?
Let me begin by expressing my appreciation for the opportunity to return to the new school for one of Arian's conferences. I had the privilege of doing that once before on the topic of military intervention. I want to thank her, even though she gave me an impossible topic to deal with, the Judeo-Christian tradition in 20 minutes. You can imagine what you'll do to the tradition in 20 minutes, but I will do my best. And so I'll proceed in the following way. First, I want to say a word about situating my remarks. Secondly, to examine selectively ideas in the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian Gospels. Thirdly, to use three examples of more contemporary statement of Judeo-Christian tradition on giving and caring for others. And then a final word on the capacity of that tradition to engage public policy arguments about caring and giving today. Obviously, I've been asked to engage two different traditions, each of which has a long history, each of which cultivated multiple arguments and distinctions, and each of which have strongly held views. Each of the traditions, in fact, has both a personal ethic, an ethic to guide personal conscience, and a social ethic embedded within it. The double focus of each of the traditions will be part of what I will try to at least illustrate in my remarks. And then finally, in addressing obligations of care of the stranger, it is useful to note from the beginning that both traditions invoke the basic categories of love and justice, and both of them are rooted in the conception of a common single human community that is bound together by moral obligations. So let me begin with the tradition of which I clearly do not have expert control, the Jewish tradition, and offer a snapshot of it. I'm guided here to certain ideas and exemplary texts by a contemporary Jewish scholar, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, whom we had the privilege of having at Harvard within this past week. He is the Grand Rabbi of the United Kingdom and has published extensively on the Jewish tradition. He focuses in commenting on the obligation to address the needs of others, particularly their social economic needs. He focuses on an idea and an institution. The idea is the Jewish understanding of compassion. The Jewish word for compassion, tzedakah, I'm sure I didn't pronounce that appropriately, but I tried. The word means both love and justice, Rabbi Sacks tells us, and it also engages justice from the perspective of distributive justice. He contrasts this with mishpat, which is the conception of legal justice, but in addressing the needs of others, the primacy lies with compassion. Rabbi Sacks illustrates the meaning of compassion by exemplary text from the Hebrew Scriptures, texts such as, "Do not ill-treat a stranger or oppress those others, because you were strangers once in the land of Egypt. Do not take advantage of a widow or an orphan." And then, as he puts it, the summary text, when you give to others, is symbolized by Deuteronomy 15:18. "You shall open your hand wide to the needy person and securely offer him what is sufficient for his needs in that which he lacks." He makes the point that behind the Deuteronomy text is a recognition that poverty is not only materially harmful to people, but that poverty often bestows a sense of humiliation on those who receive from others, and that the Jewish conception of compassion has obligations not only to give, but to give in a way that preserves the sense of dignity and lessens the sense of humiliation. Moreover, his point is that giving to others has as its goal not only satisfying immediate material needs, but also helping to move others to what Rabbi Sacks calls a condition of independence, so that, as he puts it, in turn, the person who has received finds an ability at that point in their life or later to give to others. Now, this idea of compassion, of course, is complemented in the Jewish tradition by two great institutions. I think they're best described as corrective moments in Israelite society. That is to say, designated times when the society as a whole has the opportunity to set things right within the community. Those two institutions are the sabbatical year, the 7th year, and the Jubilee year, the 50th year. It is interesting to note that within the last 10 to 15 years, the Jubilee year was used symbolically and collaboratively by a number of religious traditions to effectively lobby on the reduction of third world debt. It was a creative use of this ancient Jewish tradition adopted by Jews, Christians, Muslims, and others in the United States, and leveraging the U.S. government on the question of third world debt. In addition to this personal dimension of compassion, of course, the Jewish tradition is marked by the prophetic voice. The social prophets, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and others, brought to bear upon the task of giving and caring what one might call a structural view of the problem. Their concern was the nation as a whole, and they brought the nation as a whole under critique on a regular basis. the prophets always asked structural as well as personal questions. They asked about land ownership, treatment of workers, conditions of equity in the community. And the prophetic argument, in a sense, was best expressed, I think, by the notion of how it connected faith with justice. For the prophets, the quality of your faith, they said to Israel, is dependent substantially on the character of justice in the land. And in order to illustrate what they meant by the structural questions, they always were able to take the next step and say, and we will provide you with a test for the character of justice in the society. In every age and in every time, you are to ask how orphans, widows, and resident aliens fare in our society. Those were the three most vulnerable groups of people in Israelite society. But it is striking to remark that if you ask the Congressional Budget Office today who the three most vulnerable groups are in the United States, of course, it's women, children, and immigrants. So the voice of the prophets, with its structural focus, resounds down to our own time in specificity. Finally, the prophets always, along with the psalmists in Israel, remind us that God has special care of the poor. And in a sense, what one seeks to do in caring and giving to others is to imitate the mercy and compassion of God himself. Let me turn to the Christian Gospels. The general principle, as one transits from the Hebrew scriptures to the Christian scriptures, the general principle at work interpretively is a principle of continuity and discontinuity. The Christian scriptures, in many different ways, are directly dependent upon the Jewish tradition in so many ways. Particularly in Matthew's gospel, we find this theme of continuity and discontinuity expressed. Matthew wrote for a community of Jews who had become Christians, and he goes to some length to try to illustrate to the new Christians that much of what they already knew from Jewish faith was continued in the Christian Gospels. There's an abiding dependence that to this very day Christian thought must express to the voice and vision of the Hebrew prophets. They are central to the Christian understanding of what our obligations are in terms of giving to others and caring for strangers. Rabbi Sachs pointed out that the Jewish notion of compassion always, the word used meant two things. It meant love and justice. And we find in the Christian tradition another approach to the same theme. The grounding of Christian morality is often stated to be the so-called Great Commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with your whole mind, your whole soul, and your whole self, and you should love your neighbor as yourself. The text is taken, in fact, from the Hebrew Scriptures. Karl Rahner, the German Catholic theologian, argued that what Christianity added to these two texts was to value the second commandment with equality with the first. They have different objects of concern, God and the neighbor, but the argument was that the second commandment weighed as heavily on the Christian conscience as the first. The classical texts that point us toward giving and sharing in the Christian Gospels cut across the various Gospels. There is, of course, Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, or Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. There one illustrates the continuity-discontinuity connect. Jesus cites again and again Jewish practice and tradition and says that he honors every jot and tittle of it. He also adds to it, if you will, expanding it in different ways, but never moving in a contradictory way to what had been held, but in a sense trying to expand the original command to take in new perspectives. Luke's gospel offers us the classical example of the Good Samaritan, the man who found someone by the side of the road after more religiously tutored people had walked by him. And in Luke's gospel, the Good Samaritan is an interesting example of caring for strangers, because Samaritans were regarded as outside the normal community. And therefore, Luke's example that the Samaritan was the one with an eye for the edge of the circle of life is a particularly powerful example of caring for strangers. Finally, there is Matthew 25, which is sometimes called the judgment of the nations, Jesus' last sermon, where he separates the world into those who have fulfilled the great commandments and those who haven't. And those who have fulfilled it found in those to whom they gave the very person of Jesus himself. Now, the judgment on the nation sermon, in a sense, takes us to, again, the social dimension of things. And here it is necessary to remark that in Christian theology, some of the best interpreters of the social ethic of Christian theology make the point that it is difficult to take the gospel texts themselves on face value and develop from it a social ethic. Or perhaps to put it better, in order to develop a social ethic, one needs work beyond the actual text. Reinhold Niebuhr, who from this city commanded the heights of Christian social ethics in the midsection of the 20th century, had argued that you cannot find an adequate social ethic in the text read facially themselves. The primary focus tended to be personal response of Christians, but embedded in that was the capability for what a theologian might call the development of doctrine, expanding beyond the personal to the social. So let me offer 3 examples of how this happens, if you will. They are purely snapshots. Rabbi Sachs in The Dignity of Difference, and I draw on this selectively. One dimension of this work, The Dignity of Difference, one dimension of this work of contemporary Jewish argument is Rabbi Sachs seeking to provide direction morally for the vast, complex process of globalization that, as one political scientist has argued, is the dominant characteristic of world politics today. It's interesting to note that as Rabbi Sachs seeks to provide moral direction to globalization, he parallels the thought of John Paul II in his 1990 encyclical Centesimus Annus. Both men recognized that the political, economic, cultural, dynamic of globalization has produced both unprecedented aggregate wealth and at the same time has at times aggregated the problem of national and global inequality. Neither of them, on the basis of that assessment, are willing to condemn the process of globalization. Both seek to provide moral direction to this complex phenomenon. And both of them use the market as their case study, arguing that the market, in fact, has certain distinct assets in a way to organize an economy, but at the same time, the market, while it has an ability to produce great wealth, does not, by its own logic, tend to the distribution of wealth in any sense that would pass moral muster. So the market is not to be condemned, nor is globalization, but neither of them are to be accepted as forces of nature. Both of them have their own logic, but not their own ethic. The ethic required is a framework that would direct us to giving and sharing with others. Beyond Sachs, we have Reinhold Niebuhr, who took the love and justice relationship and articulated it into a sophisticated framework for Christian social ethics. Niebuhr argued that love was the ultimate norm of Christian morality, especially that self-sacrificial love that was represented by the life and ministry of Jesus. But Niebuhr, while honoring love, argued that it was inadequate as a social ethic as one found it stated in the gospel. Love needed to be complemented by justice, and therefore justice becomes the way in which the command of love is translated into the complex framework of societal interaction, which Niebuhr argued is always marked by power and interest, as well as the possibility of self-giving and generosity. The work of justice is the work of love, Niebuhr argued, up to the point where you move beyond those obligations one has to other and begin to share supererogatorily goods and time and talent or other ways of sharing with others in a way that goes beyond the obligations of justice. The third example of development of a social ethic is Catholic social teaching. Here we talk about a tradition rather than a single author, and this tradition, in a sense, has turned to philosophical categories for the purpose of taking the biblical insight and expanding it in two directions, addressing complexity and addressing pluralism. The biblical ethic is powerful in its imagery, but not distinguishing in terms of categories which can take apart, if you will, and analyze the complex reality of society. The object of Catholic social teaching is to use Aristotle's categories of justice, social and distributive justice, and to complement those with characteristics of society that would be marked by a sense of the common good, and in more recent Catholic teaching, the option for the poor. The objective of the teaching is to establish, on the basis of rights and duties, a minimal framework which would undergird people based on their human dignity. It is not, as the others are not, an egalitarian conception of justice, but it is a demanding conception of justice as one works out common good, option for the poor, and distributive justice. Final point to make, I think, is that these are all resources, and they're resources within a religious tradition. One of the questions to ask is the capability of that tradition to engage public discourse about the issues of our time, nationally and internationally. Here, two themes arise. Should a religious tradition use explicitly religious language in seeking to dissect, interpret, and communicate an ethic of public policy, or should it, on its own, seek to translate its deepest religious convictions into non-religious language, more accessible to others? The second is a question of whether the ethic itself is devoted wholly to principles or is willing to descend to the level of what some have called casuistry in the past, explicit case analysis with policy recommendations. My own judgment has always been it is best if we can try to share the social ethic of a religious community in the broader terms of philosophy that others can understand. And I think while principles are essential, in fact, they are not adequate to illustrate the force of the principles unless we're willing to deal with specific cases and specific recommendations, although that is to be done with some humility. Thank you.
Okay, let's turn to Amy. Good.
Could we have the PowerPoint, please? Thank you. Why does that happen fast? Why am I seeing this on that one screen?
I don't know. Let's do it again. It's not at our end. Can you switch? Yeah. Can,
Oh, it's up at the top. We can't see that.
I know, but he's got the button to swap displays and we don't.
Right. We have two windows open. We should close one.
No, that's all right.
What happens if I go full screen? Oh, we can't.
Sorry, thanks. So, Swap displays, there it was. Go back. And there. If you don't mind, just use your arrows from here.
Okay, fine.
That won't cut into your time.
Great, thank you very much. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I thank you for the invitation to speak. I think following on the previous speaker's comment, it's interesting the extent to which we're crossing certain kinds of boundaries in speaking about faiths not our own, about traditions not our own. I do believe that we come to each investigation with a certain perspective and certain tools, and that helps bring insights. And it's one of the things that persuades me to keep going with this work. Charity in Islamic, that was not my fault. Okay. Charity in Islamic societies has become a popular topic in the press of the early 21st century. Sadly, the discussions there have most often focused on the misuse of charitable funds, while ignoring the more compelling aspects of Muslim practices of charitable giving. These have their roots in religious belief and have been articulated in sacred texts and interpretive writings since the earliest era of Islam. My aim here is to offer a much richer picture and more complex investigation of charity in Islamic societies to demonstrate how central an aspect it has been and continues to be of Muslim belief and practice. In the issue of Time magazine from July 22nd, 1957, there appeared a lengthy obituary of Sir Sultan Muhammad Shah Aga Khan, the 48th Imam, or spiritual leader, of some 20 million Ismaili Muslims living in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Together with the description of his dedicated 72-year leadership and colorful personal history and lifestyle, the article noted, "The ancient Muslim tradition of tossing a coin to the leprous beggar in the square was brought up to date by the Aga Khan in huge endowments to hospitals and schools." The photo shows the Aga Khan on the diamond jubilee of his reign, balancing his weight against that of diamonds, whose value had been contributed by members of the Ismaili community in celebration of the occasion. This money was donated to fund projects like schools and hospitals. Now, the reference to the Aga Khan's fame as a generous and beneficent leader of his community was clearly meant as a sincere tribute to his impressive philanthropic endeavors. However, it also demonstrated that the author of the obituary in Time magazine was completely ignorant of the charity ethic that is an inseparable part of Muslim belief and practice. It also suggested that many of the great achievements of Islamic culture, notably the architectural wonders that have so impressed foreign travelers in the Muslim world, were largely opaque structures without context or history for non-Muslims. And the obituary further suggests that the popular image of charity in Islam for Americans in the mid-20th century was of a rather simplistic and unorganized practice. Let's look at another image. This one is of a Mughal painting from about 400 years ago in the early 17th century, entitled "Emperor Jahangir Weighing His Son Khurram in Gold." It was the custom of these Muslim rulers of India to weigh the sultans and princes on their birthdays. Balanced against each person would be gold, and then in turn, silver, silk, perfumes, copper, iron, salt, grains, rice, and other commodities contributed by the rulers. These would then be distributed as charitable donations to worthy recipients. The weighing practice was not originally Muslim, but rather a Hindu practice encountered by the Muslims when they conquered India. Its incorporation into the ceremonies of the ruling Mughal dynasty was approved by Muslim jurists as being in accordance with the charitable obligations of devout Muslims and even reminiscent of a known Muslim practice. Now, consider as well the following images and the dates when these structures were built. A medieval hospital in eastern Anatolia, the Suleymaniya Mosque and the colleges, hospital, public kitchen, markets, and other structures attached to it in Istanbul, the Taj Mahal in Agra, a public fountain in Jerusalem, and finally, a pool built in the early 9th century on Darb Zubaydah, the pilgrimage route from Baghdad to Mecca. Each of these structures is part of a charitable endeavor. A voluntary donation, or sadaqah, which is a cognate to the word tzedakah in Hebrew, which was discussed in the previous talk. So they were voluntary donations made in order to bring benefit to members of the Muslim community, and in many cases to whoever might avail themselves of the services provided there. Whoa, I'm sorry. I'm not a Mac person, so I keep touching things accidentally. I'm sorry. Yet these are only the most visible and enduring evidence of charitable practices in Muslim communities. Donations may take many forms and be of substantial or modest value. They can be material or monetary, but also take the form of a helping hand, a blessing, or a good wish. Voluntary giving permeates Islamic societies, and to the extent that we have historical evidence for it in buildings, documents, historical chronicles, and stories, it seems that this has always been the case. Yet this is only one aspect of the giving practiced by Muslims. There are 5 fundamental obligations, sometimes called the 5 pillars, incumbent upon all Muslims: the declaration of faith, prayer, annual fasting during the month of Ramadan, the once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, and obligatory almsgiving, zakat. Now, zakat is calculated on wealth and on annual earned income. In the Quran, this obligation is frequently linked with prayer, and the phrase salat wa zakat is a core expression of adherence to Islam. The Quran says, "Only he shall inhabit God's places of worship who believes in God and the last day, and performs the prayer, and pays the alms, and fears none but God alone." More specifically, the word zakat comes from an Aramaic root, meaning to purify, and the zakat payment is crucial for the purification of legitimately earned gain, as well as for the expiation of the sins of the giver. The obligation to pay zakat was set in Muhammad's own lifetime and was understood as emphatic proof of acceptance of Islam, as well as loyalty, including political loyalty, to the young community. The Quran, and especially the Hadith, that is, the reports about what the Prophet Muhammad said and did, explain in detail the obligation to pay zakat and the hideous penalties to be endured by those who failed to do so. The hideous penalties, however, would come after one's death on the Day of Judgment and would, of course, be invoked by God. Zakat, however, is not the same as voluntary charity because it is imposed as a commandment by God, one of the 5 pillars. Therefore, payment of zakat is a reflection of belief and obedience, and not, first and foremost, an expression of beneficent feeling toward other people. Yet this ideological distinction or theoretical distinction is intellectual and scholarly, for popular understanding also frames the payment of zakat as a reflection of beneficence. Moreover, zakat is the only one of the 5 pillars which compels people to engage with other human beings. The others are all individual acts. Based on Quranic specifications, zakat is to be distributed among the poor and indigent. Those are actually 2 different categories of people, those who have nothing and those who work but cannot sustain themselves even from their own labors. The other categories are the zakat collectors, those whose hearts need to be reconciled to Islam, and zakat is also used to ransom slaves, to rescue debtors, to support those in God's way, and for the traveler. Obviously, these categories are not based uniquely on economic need, but rather reflect the communal concerns and cultural practices of early Muslims. The community included recent converts who needed assistance as well as encouragement in their choice to join this small, struggling group. Those in God's way were initially identified as volunteers in jihad, but the category quickly expanded to include Muslim students and teachers of Islamic studies and has expanded further over the centuries. Travelers, interestingly, are included in the list because their distance from home can leave them without sufficient material resources and a supportive community close at hand, no matter how well off they may be actually when at home. The Quran repeatedly recommends the giving and performing of sadaqah, understood as charity, voluntary charity, in a broad sense. Socially, both zakat and sadaqah contribute to the solidarity of the Muslim community and to its well-being. However, early Muslim usage established the distinction between the two, which seems to be reflected in the passage from the Quran, which says, "True piety is this, to believe in God and the last day, the angels, the book, and the prophets, to give of one's substance, however cherished, to kinsmen and orphans, the needy, the traveler, beggars, and to ransom the slave, to perform the prayer, to pay the alms as a separate act." Believers are enjoined to make voluntary donations beyond what they pay in zakat. Legitimate recipients of sadaqah, voluntary donations, include the same people who can receive zakat, with the addition of close family members. The theological importance of sadaqah stems from its power to expiate sin or increase one's chances of attaining paradise. Moreover, sadaqah can be performed in place of other canonical requirements, as a legitimate substitute for fasting, for example, if one is ill or pregnant, or instead of certain other required rituals. So as far as we understand, in its earliest form, zakat was closely regulated and collected in the Muslim community. But with the expansion of the first Islamic state and then the creation of multiple states, the organized collection of zakat doesn't seem to have endured systematically, and we have great difficulties establishing a historical narrative of zakat payment and distribution. Against the great difficulties establishing, against the detailed legal texts, there exists only scattered evidence for the organization of zakat in the successive Muslim states and empires through the 19th century. In the 20th century, some Muslim states like Saudi Arabia, Libya, Malaysia, Pakistan, Kuwait, Sudan, and Yemen have again established the collection of zakat under state auspices, including sometimes being taken at source from salaries. However, even where zakat was not and is not collected officially, many practicing Muslims, probably most, perhaps most, pay it regularly. Today, many Muslim charitable organizations have the word zakat in their names, and websites exist in numerous languages to help believers calculate what they owe, in much the same way that there exist computer programs for calculating U.S. income tax. And the zakat laws, in fact, are quite complex. I give you just one example. One pays at the end of a year on what one has beyond the cost of living for a year. And in our modern world, where we have many more financial instruments than existed in the 7th century, the calculation of that is actually quite complicated. Historically, however, it remains an open question as to how zakat payments and distributions were effected, with the possibility that they devolved to the level of purely individual interactions, perhaps with guidance from community leaders, and the rare intervention of state authorities. In fact, this does not entirely contradict the precepts of zakat paying found in the Quran and in the subsequent writings of various Muslim scholars. These texts stress the merits of paying zakat and giving sadaqah in secret for the benefit of both recipient and donor. And the best kind of a sadaqah, in fact, is that where the right hand does not know what the left hand is doing. So it creates a barrier between donor and recipient that preserves the dignity of the recipient and helps to shield the donor from overweening pride in his or her act. Another form of donation with a similar name is zakat al-fitr. This is a small sum due from every member of a Muslim household during the month of Ramadan, before the final Eid al-Fitr celebrations. It is obligatory, but not of the same rank of obligation with zakat. The money is meant to enable poorer Muslims to celebrate the holiday. My own experience with Muslim friends is that even those who are in no way observant throughout the year and don't fast even on Ramadan do give some kind of charitable donation during the holy month. It's extraordinary to me, in fact, when I began to hear about this. Muslim aid agencies, local and transnational, usually have major campaigns to solicit donations during Ramadan, and there are any number of ways in which believers can pay their zakat al-fitr, including by texting donations via the cellular telephone companies. The companies deduct the payment from the user's accounts and offer the cost of the message for free as their part of the donation. Tracing the history of sadaqah is often as difficult, if not more so, than that of zakat. Voluntary charity can take countless different forms, including a prayer or blessing from the person who has nothing, or as little as half a date. Every coin dropped in the hand of a beggar, bit of food taken to an ailing or indigent neighbor, kind act or word is counted as charity as long as it is performed with sincere intent to do good. And the intent, the niyyah in Islam, which is cognate to kavanah in the Jewish tradition, is a crucial point of each act. And there is an enormous amount of writing which points out that the only person, the only force which knows the kavanah, the intent, the niyyah of the giver, is God. So in fact, much of this is couched as a calculus of the relationship between God and the believer. One hadith quotes the Prophet, "If you give in charity what equals one date fruit from honestly earned money, and Allah accepts only honestly earned money, Allah takes it in his right hand and then enlarges its reward for that person who has given it, as any one of you brings up his baby horse, so much so that it becomes as big as a mountain." Most evidence for voluntary charity is thus anecdotal and unsystematic, and when it is not ethnographic or folkloristic, draws from the spectrum of literary sources for the history of Islamic societies, including the accounts of foreign observers. At the same time, however, one highly visible and regulated form of voluntary charity did develop in Muslim societies. This was the pious endowment or foundation, known commonly as waqf. Waqfs, while tracing their roots to Roman, Byzantine, and Sasanian practices, were a particular Muslim form of endowment that became increasingly popular from about the 10th century. In its basic form, a waqf comprises properties endowed for the benefit of a particular purpose. The properties, the purpose, and an endowment manager are usually specified in an endowment deed registered with a judge, once constituted. The endowment is irrevocable and unalterable, according to one of the Muslim schools of law, except according to stipulations laid down in the original deed or otherwise approved by a judge. In theory, the waqf provided for the permanent maintenance of its beneficiaries, whether they be people, buildings, institutions, or some combination of all three. Although the largest waqfs, and this is one, supported enormous mosque complexes, mostly founded by sultans, the women of their households, or their chief ministers, a waqf was not by definition an enormous undertaking. Any owner of freehold property could set up an endowment, subject to a few basic conditions. A waqf could be sustained by the revenues generated from the rent of a single room in a house, dedicated to supporting a reciter of Quran verses at someone's tomb, for example. Or the revenues could be directed to support the family of the founder, either specific members or the entire family. An endowment might be made to add to an existing waqf if a person preferred to contribute to some larger, more prestigious foundation. For example, over hundreds of years, countless Muslims have made endowments to support the central mosques of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, as well as the pilgrims who made their way there. What distinguishes waqf making from other forms of voluntary charity in Muslim societies is the scope of evidence it is left behind. Endowment deeds exist as a single and sometimes beautiful documents, as well as copies edited into the register of the court proceedings, and even carved in stone on the front of an endowed building. So on the left, there's an early endowment deed from Anatolia, written in Ottoman Turkish, and on the right is, in fact, the endowment deed of another foundation, which is carved into the doorway. So right beside the door, we have this enormous inscription of the conditions of the waqf, and it was meant to be there so that it would be easy to find them, and no one could claim to be ignorant of what was supposed to be happening in that institution. Depending on the nature and longevity of a single endowment, it might create physical monuments to testify to the beneficent undertaking of that individual, as well as naming and reshaping the topography of a city, as in the case of the Süleymaniye that we saw in Istanbul and the neighborhood that has its name. Depending on the founder and the subsequent management, it could generate extensive account ledgers. And these endowments were made not only by Muslims, but also by Christians and Jews living in a Muslim majority society, because the Muslim legal culture was the dominant one, and therefore the best way to ensure that your institution would last. Clearly, Waqf served a wide range of purposes beyond the obvious and stated charitable goals. The endowment deeds always pointed to the founder's desire to come closer to God and often cited the beneficent character of the donor. However, they could serve additional functions, the provision of ritual, educational, and health services, and much of what we consider to be welfare or social services was in fact sustained by large endowments in the Ottoman period, which is that I know best, but also in preceding Islamic periods and in other parts of the Muslim world. It could promote communitarian or sectarian interests by developing institutions. It was a way to preserve family wealth. It protected wealth from imperial confiscation. It sustained the quest for imperial legitimation, and it reinforced social hierarchies and cultural norms. Most notably, however, when comparing them with other forms of philanthropy that we may know, waqfs endured and over many generations. And many of these endowment deeds stipulated that one of the first things that any revenues should pay for was the upkeep of the institution. I'm sure that any university president would be interested to hear that clause. Their potential was recognized in a saying attributed to the Prophet: when a person dies, his achievement expires, except with regard to three things: ongoing charity, sadaqah jariyah, which is a waqf, or knowledge from which people benefit, or a son who prays for him. Today, popular views of Islamic charitable endeavors, in this country in particular, I think, are often shaped by alarmist headlines linking Muslim giving with the funding of terror, suggesting that garbled notions of Muslim charity persist. While one can understand the sensationalist appeal of discussing the diversion of charitable funds to support violent action, such a focus misrepresents the real importance of charitable giving and action in Muslim communities. It also exaggerates the differences between Muslim ideas and ideals of charitable giving and those of other belief and value systems. People continue to put coins into the hands of beggars, but the colorful weighing ceremonies of Sir Sultan Mohammed Shah Aga Khan were replaced after his death by the Aga Khan Foundation, established by his grandson and successor, the present Aga Khan. This and other local, national, and transnational organizations are sustained by donations of all sizes from Muslims around the world. They, together with countless individual actions, demonstrate how charitable giving continues to be central to the practice of Islam. Thank you.
Well, it is a great pleasure to be here, and I will say that giving asks many questions of us. How does giving express deeply human values? What are the motivations of the giver? Why do people give? And all of us who are involved in colleges and universities and nonprofit enterprises, or as I am in an ongoing research project, recognize just how persistent is the need to cultivate donors and donations. And those deeply involved in fundraising recognize some of the reasons why people give, and that relationships are critical to funding. Now, people might give a gift because they believe in a cause, whatever it be, and consider it to be in harmony with the things they most deeply believe in. They might give because they believe in people. The people in charge, like Deo, for example, they trust the recipient with the judgment to do something useful. They might give because they can't stand the ethical dilemmas of poverty or illness or illiteracy in a world that rightly should be able to provide for all. Or they might give because it gives them a kind of social or ethical recognition that wealth alone does not provide. The name of a hospital wing, for example, or a college building or a scholarship. It confers what the psychologist Robert J. Lifton refers to as symbolic immortality. And they might give because it gives them and the recipient a relationship that in itself is to be cherished. They might give because they have received, and that locution of service work as giving back that is so common among the students with whom I live at Harvard College is something very important. The recognition that they return to society some of the ways in which they themselves have had gifts given to them. And in all these ways, the act of giving is itself filled with meaning and with expectation. One of the classic theorists of the gift in anthropology is Marcel Mauss, who saw from his inquiry, largely among the people of Polynesia and Northwest America, the gift is what establishes relationships in society. Gifts which are, as he put it, in theory, voluntary, disinterested, and spontaneous, are in fact obligatory and interested. Gift-giving creates a set of relationships that proceed from giving and receiving and reciprocating. A gift is not something you get for free, for there's no such thing as a free gift. A gift entails obligations and, quote, compels the recipient to make a return. So when you give something to someone else, and this is why Mauss is still referred to in modern understandings of giving, whether that something is a bottle of wine to the host of a dinner party or a multi-million-dollar endowment to a college, it's more complex. It's more than a gesture of generosity. It's the initiation or perhaps the extension of a relationship. Indeed, one could argue, as Mauss does, that gift-giving and the nuanced obligations of giver and receiver are what create the very sinews of the body of society. The gift might be said to be the, quote, bedrock of human moral relations, and the study of gift circulation is the study of social interconnectedness. Now, I begin here with Marcel Mauss because the religious gift, dana, in the Indic context of Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions, actually has a very different foundation. Dana, which has been highly theorized by scholars of Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain ethics, is not really part of a web of reciprocity and obligation. In fact, rather, dana flows from the giver, usually a householder with something to give, with absolutely no expectation of return, and precisely to those people who represent a set of values utterly contrary to their own culture of what they call getting and keeping, namely the value of renunciation, the renunciation of wealth. These are renunciants, whether you call them sadhus, holy men, sannyasis, monks, and nuns, who have been extensively studied and who are extensively part of the religious communities of South Asia. And in this context, dana, as the Amherst scholar Maria Heim, who has studied this most extensively, writes, dana is something very different from the reciprocal gift-giving practices that are the norm in the view of Mauss. The moral norm of reciprocity, she writes, does not allow us to consider why human beings might assign worth to unilateral, asymmetrical giving that resists the logic of exchange. Now, I've been asked explicitly to reflect on the religious and philosophical foundations of giving in the Indic traditions, and I use that word to mean Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain because they're all related and they share a common milieu in ancient Indian civilization. But let me say at the outset that there certainly are traditions of philanthropy in India among these people that extend from royal temple endowments, patronage, the building of rest houses to provide for pilgrims, and there are inscriptions galore to record such traditions of gift giving. And they extend today to Hindus in the US and to traditions of business patronage and philosophical philanthropic traditions of very well-known business and industrial families with their own trusts and charities for hospitals, educational institutions, temples, and social projects. But I take as my task today something very different, which is to investigate the understandings of wealth in a culture that has long valued its opposite, the renunciation of all wealth. So first, regarding wealth. Giving expresses in complex ways how we human beings regard wealth and the circulation of wealth in society. What is wealth? Whose is it? Are individuals the owners of wealth, the stewards, or perhaps the trustees? In the religious worlds of Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains, there is a nexus of persistent religious values that have not been swept aside by modernity. Implicitly, the very world of the material economy is a world described by flow, change, and impermanence. After all, taking a long view, the perpetual changing river of life and death, production and accumulation, cannot be owned, cannot be fenced in or ultimately grasped and held. It is the world we live in, that is described by a word of motion, the word samsara, a word and a world in motion that is related to the logic of renunciation. How do we live in such a world? How are we to take seriously our responsibility in the realm of societies and institutions, and at the same time recognize the deeper value and truth of the transience and necessary impermanence of wealth? We all know the truisms in our own world that money can't buy you happiness or you can't take it with you. But imagine societies in which a whole class of people over the centuries, people who are visible in the streets and at your front door, voluntarily testify, will witness, you might say, to these truisms in their ascetic lives of renunciation. The Buddha is but one example of the prince who had everything, perhaps the most well-known among us here, and yet who let it all go, left it behind, to take on the life of an ascetic or mendicant, a seeker. The Buddha's teachings put it succinctly in ways that would be central to the whole spectrum of Indian thought on the matter, that human suffering, anxiety, the out-of-jointness of the human condition, is not limited to the poor or to victims of war or disaster. It is universal. It is not inborn nor a moral failure, but it has a cause, and it is caused by our craving and grasping, our attempt to hold on tight to a world of flow, our attachment to material things that are transient, ephemeral, and ultimately unsatisfying. A contemporary Buddhist teacher gives an analogy of this human dilemma, describing the orchard owner's monkey trap in Thailand, where monkeys are caught precisely because they are able to slip their little fingers into a hole that has been made in a coconut. They grab the sweet thing that's inside because they want it, but they can't withdraw their hand with the grabbing fist still holding on to the sweet. They're caught precisely because they're unable to let go. Now, human beings can figure out this dilemma if we try, and there are those who slip out of the world who actually do let go of the grasping and clutching and possessive world of getting and keeping. Renunciants are very much part of the Indic traditions even today. Hindu sadhus, Buddhist monks, nuns, Jain sadhus, and sadhvis are those who stand apart from, though in relation to, household society. And the rest of us, householders who literally have houses to live in, we are the ones who go about the business of work and building and the maintenance of the rest of society. That's how it should be. That's our role, our dharma, so to speak, that we are to support the others, the students who have not yet entered the world of work, for example, or the retirees who have seen the birth of grandchildren and spotted their gray hairs, or the renunciants who have renounced not only the world of work and material possession, getting and keeping, but have actually renounced family, indeed self, for a life focused on spiritual freedom. And the rites of renunciation are many, lying on one's own funeral pyre, for example, rising then to a life stripped to the bare minimum. So what is it that links the world of the householder with that of renouncers? That is the gift, the religious gift, dana. And our classic image is that of the renouncer with the begging bowl making daily rounds, and that relation of donor to recipient is asymmetrical, giving to those who have given up everything and whose lives represent not a rebuke, but a reminder of an aspiration counter to the culture of material. In Thailand, it might be the laity distributing food from the doors of their homes and shops in the morning to Buddhist monks who pass on the street, or at the Thai temple in the US, where the laity bring baskets of toothpaste and soap and rice and everything that monks need in the course of daily life because the monks live their life outside the economy of money. Or in the Jain context, the orders of Jain monks and nuns who circulate among householders and are supported by them. And next month, for example, when the great Kumbh Mela pilgrimage takes place in India, as it does every 12 years at the confluence of the Ganga and Yamuna River, there will be hundreds of thousands of sadhus, of Hindu ascetic orders, who will encamp for more than a month. And pilgrims are drawn by the millions, by the 30 millions on the great bathing days, not only by the confluence of the sacred rivers, but primarily by the presence among them in settled society of these hundreds of thousands of sadhus, many of them naked for the great bathing days. And when you see that, which you surely will if you watch the spectacle recorded on television, that's all they're really interested in, is the naked babas processing for their bath in the Ganga. But this is an expression of what a scholar calls viewing India as a whole. This ideal of sannyasi continues to stir the Hindu psyche, and the alluring tones of renunciation still serve as counterpoint to the complex symphony of worldly life. Giving without getting anything in return. So how should one give? Toward the end of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna teaches Arjuna about the gift and the dispositions that attend the act of giving. A gift is pure, he said, if it is given in a good time and place to a fit recipient who cannot give you anything in return. A gift is tainted with passion if it's given reluctantly to secure some service in return or to gain a future reward. And a gift is dark if it's given ungraciously with contempt to an unfit recipient. Scripturally speaking, the best of donations, or dan, are to be disinterested. Gupta dan, they call it, a secret or anonymous gift with no expectation. The anthropologist Erica Bornstein has written a book called Disquieting Gifts, Humanitarianism in New Delhi. She looks at a whole range of giving and humanitarian projects which highlight the tension between the impulse to give without attachment in the scriptural sense and the social obligation to create a just society. Perhaps giving to a documented, organized charity, for example, regulated by accounting systems. But the anonymous renunciative aspect of giving is resistant to regulation. She writes from her interviews with the temple priest, "Dan is given to strangers. It does not matter whether the recipients are Hindu. What matters is that an attachment or relationship with the recipient does not exist. There's no personal relationship. And she describes a household in Delhi, which she has studied, where every day sadhus and other poor and elderly line up for this kind of anonymous dawn. And one day it's 5 rupees apiece, the next day it's rice, but nobody knows one another's names, neither the sadhus the name of the people who are the donors, nor the donors the names of the sadhus. 77% of donations in India are given in this ad hoc fashion, says this Indian Center for Philanthropy. Only 21% given to organized charities. So you can imagine the dilemma here. She cites the newsletter of an NGO in Delhi, which contrasts Western and Hindu ideas of giving, noting that in the West, people remain attached to their donation, are interested in knowing how their money is being used, perhaps even a picture of the recipient. In Hindu terms, however, donors are required to detach themselves from the object that's been donated. Daন requires tyag, relinquishment. This tyag cannot be achieved if we remain attached to the outcome. Among the things that is interesting about religious donations in the Indian context is that they are not tax-deductible donations in government concern. They're totally unregulated by the state. And one great example of this Gupta Daan, the anonymous gift, is the gift giving at a great Hindu temple, like the temple of Tirupati in South India, where the hundi, or the bank for donation within the temple, the box that receives the gifts of worshipers, collects some $40 million in cash donation each year, to say nothing of the gold and jewelry that are provided. But none of this circulates through an economy of charitable giving that is recorded. And the T.T. Devasthanams, which is the institute that runs the temple and its affiliated charities, has schools and colleges, a medical school, and its special school that trains people in prosthetic limbs. But the reciprocity between donor and giver is completely unknown. The disposition of giving is also enhanced by the act of giving. And this is certainly the way in which the Dalai Lama speaks of altruism as the ability to cultivate a generosity that radically reorients us and to counteract our tendency to guard our possessions. That the practice of giving as an outwardly manifest act enforces the inward disposition to give, which is the entire movement of the Buddha's path. The goal of the path is not the creation of just structures, but the destruction of greed and hate and delusion, and the cultivation of generosity that are much deeper roots of the ills of society. And the Bhagavad Gita is also centered on precisely this kind of giving, in which its protagonist, Arjuna, is tempted to renounce the world in face of battle. But his divine guide, Krishna, will not allow him to do so. And he offers a teaching that transforms the meaning of renunciation, to renounce something far more important than the world of material gain, but to stay in the world as a businessman or a doctor or a teacher, but renounce the fruits of one's action, renounce one's personal stake in the battle ahead, to act without attachment to the fruits of action, to give without fingerprints on the gift. And it's that sets the stage, in conclusion, for the kind of renunciation that is transformed in the life of Gandhi, for example, who is an activist renunciant, who has given up in the sense that sannyasis had, but stayed in the world of action, as the Bhagavad Gita tells the renunciant. And he continually then turns to a teaching on wealth, and we can conclude with that. Understand, he says, that wealth is not yours. We are thieves in a way if I take anything that I do not need for my own immediate use. If only everybody took enough for himself and nothing more, there would be no pauperism in the world. Our duty is to be trustees of wealth rather than owners of it. And he challenges owners, businessmen with whom he colluded a lot in India, the Sarabhai family, for example, that if every member uses all his talents not for personal aggrandizement, but for the good of all, we would produce something that is not a dead equality where every person is rendered incapable of using his ability to the utmost possible extent, but that moneyed men, as he puts it, may earn their billions, but so as to dedicate them as trustees to the service of all. And perhaps the greatest example of that in the wake of Gandhi was the Bhudan movement, which took the notion of dan and transformed it into the giving of property to people who had none. So I'll conclude there, much more to say, but I'm very grateful for these moments to reflect on some of the aspects of giving that are perhaps not as commonly reflected upon in our Western traditions. Thank you.
Thank you. I should have a PowerPoint too, but I must admit I'm also not sure where it is. I think we're going to get some assistance. Good. Nope.
Yeah, it's okay. It's going to look like this on your screen, but it'll look correct
Oh, I
there.
see. Good. Okay. This is great. Okay, so you've been hearing about various religious traditions. I'm not presenting that. I'm presenting a contemporary secular argument for giving, which in some ways in contrast with what we've just heard, and I think makes an interesting comparison, really, an interesting historical difference. Obviously, I'm talking about what I think we ought to be doing, irrespective of any particular religious beliefs that we may have. And the slide we have here relates to both a book that I've written and a website where you can get further information about what I'm going to be talking about. Now, as I'm sure you will know, there was a tragedy that occurred in New York a couple of days ago, which occurred on the subway. Let's hope that this is working. Yes, and the New York Post had this front page, for which it was to some extent criticized as being in poor taste. But I hope you think I'm justified in using it to make what I think is an important point about the way we think about questions of saving life. This man, Ki Suk Han, was pushed onto the subway track in circumstances that are not completely clear. And the person who took the photograph was criticized for taking a photograph rather than trying to pull the man off the tracks. And there were other people on the platform too, although they're not evident in this photo. And the question was raised, why didn't people help? The man who took the photograph says that what he was really trying to do was he actually set his flash off on his camera many times in order to warn the subway train driver that there was a problem in the hope that the train driver could stop. So on his account, he did actually help, and the photo was more or less an accident that in setting it off, the photo was taken. But the point is that there was some expectation that people should have helped, even though there was a subway train approaching, and even though to help would have involved some significant risk. It's hard to say exactly in the circumstances where, how great that risk of being hit by the train would have been, but obviously there would have been some risk. The train driver clearly could not stop in time. So if you'd been helping, you may have been hit as well. What's interesting is, as I say, that this goes on all the time, while in fact there are people who are dying all around the world whom we could be helping. And the question, therefore, is why is this something on which people are not equally concerned? It doesn't make dramatic news in the way that this tragedy did. But I think it's easy to know what's going on. And that's really the nature of my argument. It's an argument I've made for many years in different articles, and I put it by telling a story of, I ask you to imagine that you're walking through a park and you pass a shallow pond, just an ornamental pond that you know, because you often walk through this park, you know is one that you could easily wade into. There's no danger of drowning, in that sense, no risk to your life as there was in this other case. But on this particular day, you notice that there is a small child who has fallen into the pond, and the child is too small to stand, although you could stand as an adult, and is in need of being rescued. So what would you do? Obviously, the first thing you would do is you would say, who's looking after this child? This child is too small to be on his own. There must be parents or a babysitter or somewhere like that. But you look around and there's nobody else there. It's only you and the child. So your next thought presumably would be, well, this child is in danger of dying. I should rush into the pond and help the child. But just as you're starting to do that, a less noble thought occurs to you, and that is that you've put on your favorite pair of shoes this morning, an expensive pair that you recently bought. They're not the kind of shoes that would stand up to wading into a muddy pond, and you don't have time to get rid of them. Are you going to incur the cost of replacing your most expensive pair of shoes in order to save this child's life? And remember, the child is a stranger to you. You have no idea who the child is, and you have no responsibility for the child being in the pond. Would it be wrong to say, well, I don't have any obligation to help this stranger, and I don't want to be up for the cost of a new pair of shoes, so I'm just going to forget about the fact that I ever saw the child and go on my way? Well, I think most of you won't take long to think, yes, that would be wrong. And that point, I think, is made by the example that I began with. If we're even debating whether somebody on the subway platform did not do what he or she ought to have done, at some risk to themselves to help the stranger off the subway tracks, then it's much more obvious still, of course, that where there is no risk at all to your life, but simply a financial expense, which is not going to be one that is going to damage your life prospects, that you ought to help, that it would be wrong not to help. And I think that's a view that is very widely shared. I've talked about this on many occasions. It's rare to find anyone who will demur. Occasionally you get some kind of hardline libertarian who says we have no obligations to help anyone, only not to harm them. But so I think there is general agreement that there is this obligation to assist, to save life where you can, at least at relatively modest cost to yourself. Sometimes it's called the rule of easy rescue, where it's quite easy to rescue someone. So if that's the case, though, then what does this mean about giving in society in general? My point is, we are all walking past the pond unless we're giving substantially to people in the world who need help in order to survive, or for their children to survive, or perhaps not quite that, but to have what we might regard as a minimally decent human life. So, as an example of the kinds of things that we have without thinking for a moment, often I sometimes speak to audiences of students and they say, well, we're not affluent people, we don't have a lot of money. So I ask them, have you in the last few days spent any money in order to get something to drink? And of course, everyone has, whether it's a bottle of water like this, whether it's a soda or a coffee or a juice, everybody has. But if you live in the United States, fortunately, you can satisfy your need to drink without paying anything. the water in New York City is safe to drink and it's free. The water in Princeton is safe to drink. It doesn't actually taste quite as good. It has more chlorine in it than here, but you can drink it, and it's free. And none of the things that I mentioned, well, with the possible exception of juice, I guess, really meets any of your nutritional requirements. So that's just one example of something that we take for granted that we're spending money on, not terribly much, but added up over a year, it probably will quite easily come to the annual income of someone living in extreme poverty, which the World Bank has a rather complicated formula on. If you adjust it for, sometimes it's currently stated as $1.25 per day purchasing power parity, but those dollars are $19.93. If you said roughly $2 a day, you wouldn't be too far out. So it's easy to get to that sort of sum. And we have to consider then what we can do with that in order to help people who are in need. So let's look at some giving that goes on before we come to that, and this will give you an example of the contrast. This is a small painting by the artist Duccio. You can, if you take the subway uptown, you can find it hanging in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's a relatively recent acquisition. I think maybe they've had it 4 or 5 years. They paid $45 million for it. Or you could say donors gave them money which enabled them to buy this painting for $45 million. Now, the Met is an institution set up to preserve its art collection and enhance its collection, and I'm not saying that the trustees of the Met could have simply taken that $45 million and given it to the poor. No doubt that would have been a violation of the purposes for which the institution was set up. But think about the donors who gave the Met the money to purchase that painting. And think about the other choices that they have faced. According to the Fred Hollows Foundation, which is an organization that performs cataract surgery in developing countries, they can restore sight to somebody for $50. Now, I'm not sure how firm that figure is, but if we take that figure as accurate, then for $45 million, you can do the sum. They could have restored sights to 900,000 people. So there are 900,000 people who can't see anything who would have their sight restored, or there are the visitors of the Met who, in going through the Met, which has a wonderful collection of paintings, of course, including paintings of this Italian late medieval, early Renaissance period, would have seen one painting fewer. And my guess is that most of them would not have noticed the difference between the collection that they viewed with or without this Duccio. So think about the value of the contrasting values you can get there. Now, you know, I'm not saying that this painting should not be preserved. It's part of humanity's heritage. But it's not the case that if the Met had not bought this painting, it would have been left out in the rain to deteriorate. Obviously, some other institution would have bought it for perhaps somewhat less money and preserved it. So I think those are the sorts of things that we need to be thinking about in thinking about whether we ought to give and to where we ought to give. Okay, so here's the argument, just to summarize what I've been saying and where the argument goes. If we can prevent something bad without sacrificing anything nearly as important, we ought to do it. Now, that's a pretty vague expression, nearly as important, but it's deliberately so. We can fill it in all sorts of different ways, but the example I gave, I don't think anybody could think that a new pair of shoes is nearly as important as a child's life. And you can think of your own examples of things that you would agree are not nearly as important as saving a child's life. Secondly, extreme poverty is bad, and again, we could have a long discussion as to why that is, but one reason is that it does mean that many people die prematurely. In particular, it means, according to UNICEF, that about 8 million children under 5 die each year from avoidable poverty-related causes. These are not from diseases that we don't know how to cure. These are from diseases like diarrhea, measles, malaria, which we do know how to cure or prevent anyway, and for which we are not putting enough resources into doing it. So we're talking about something like 22,000 children dying every day from avoidable poverty-related causes. And those are deaths that we could prevent, as I say, at no risk to our own lives and at relatively modest costs, although exactly what those costs are is debatable. So I think those two premises are pretty clear, and even if we're not talking about saving lives or saving the lives of children, of course we are talking about quality of life, where we can make huge differences by helping people to get out of a state of living that is something we would not consider really adequate for a decent human life. So the third premise is that we can prevent at least some extreme poverty. Of course, none of us, not even Bill Gates, can prevent it all, but without sacrificing anything nearly as important as the gains we're achieving. And the conclusion of the argument is, so that's what we ought to do. Now, this looks like a cogent argument to me. It looks like an argument of which the premises are true, and the argument is sound. But some people may challenge some of the premises. As I said, you can get a small number of libertarians who will challenge the first premise, but I think few people do that. I don't think anybody really challenges the second premise. Some do, though, challenge the third premise. Does aid really work is the theme of that challenge. And we have had some books in recent years questioning that. William Easterly is one, an economist down at NYU. And Dambisa Moyo also had a book called Dead Aid a few years ago that caused some discussion. Neither of them, incidentally, were talking about non-government organizations' aid. They were both focusing on governmental aid or World Bank multilateral aid of that sort. And they both say so in more or less, well, Dambisa Moyo says it early on in a passage that was not much noticed by people who used her book to mount a counter-argument to the kind of thing that I'm saying. William Easterly doesn't explicitly say it, but if you look at his index, NGOs don't really get mentioned at all. And once when I was on a panel with him and said, does he say the same kind of things about NGO, he said no. It would be more complicated to assess them, and he acknowledged that some of them do some good. And I think that's basically the truth. I'm certainly not saying that every NGO in the aid field is doing a great job. On the contrary, I think it's important to select carefully. And there are ways we can do that. This is a screenshot from GiveWell. Go to givewell.org if you want to have a look in more detail at the kind of thing they're doing. They review a large number of charities. They're extremely rigorous in their demands for data. Some people might say too rigorous and excluding a lot of good charities. Not that they say, if you look at that pie chart, you know, big lot of charities reviewed and only 1% recommended. That doesn't mean that they think 99% are bad. It simply means that for most of that 99%, they were not able to get sufficient data to convince themselves that the charities were worth supporting. And as I say, arguably they're too strict in that demand, but doesn't matter because they do come up with some that they recommend. And so this is their current #1 recommended charity, the Against Malaria Foundation, which provides insecticide impregnated bed nets to reduce malaria, and by GiveWell's rigorous assessment is highly effective. So that's one way of saving children's lives. preventing them from getting malaria, which kills a significant number of children, and incidentally, on top of that, makes a lot of people ill, of course, quite seriously ill, so it does more good than simply to prevent lives. So there are effective organisations that you can give to, and that's, I think, why the third premise of the argument that I put up there is a defensible claim. Okay, so there are various objections that can be made, that people do make about this. Some people say, well, isn't my government doing this? Aren't I paying taxes so that the government can give aid? Yes, of course, the US government does give aid, but a lot of Americans are under a very severe illusion about how much of the taxes that you pay, how much of government revenue or of the government budget goes to foreign aid. There have been a series of surveys over the years in which people are asked how much of the government's budget, that is, how much of government spending do you think the US gives in foreign aid? And the answers range from 10 to 20%. People think 10 to 20% of the US budget is going for foreign aid. These same people are then asked, do you think the US gives too much, too little, or about the right amount of aid? And of course, many of them, roughly half, say too much. And they're then asked, so what percentage of the government budget do you think should go for foreign aid? And there the answers converge around the 5 to 10% range. Now, in fact, as a percentage of the US budget of government spending, the US gives less than 1%. So we have this strange phenomenon of Americans saying the government is giving too much foreign aid, but when you ask them how much they want to give, they name a figure that's at least 5 times as much as the government is giving. So that's one reason, I think, why people sometimes think that the government is doing enough. The US government actually does very poorly, as you may know, put as a percentage of gross national product rather than of government spending. We give about a quarter, about 25 cents in every $100 that we earn as a nation, 0.25% around that. Sometimes it's been up and down over the years. Obama did say originally that he would raise it, but it hasn't risen significantly in his presidency. And that's less than a large number of other nations. It's obviously significantly less than the UN recommended target of 0.7%, which I don't think is a very demanding target in itself. There are a few countries, Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, what have I left out? Sweden and Luxembourg, I think, that exceed the UN target, giving between that and 1%. And a number of countries that are moving closer towards that, including the United Kingdom. But we are still really laggards as far as foreign aid is concerned. So that, I don't think, can serve as an excuse. A lot of people assume that when you're talking about giving, you're talking about giving food. I think we shouldn't be giving food except in extreme emergencies, because you do have a negative effect on the local food markets, and farmers need to get rewarded for growing food to be given incentives. So obviously we can give in other ways, and I think there's lots of work to show that there are ways of giving that do not produce dependency but encourage people to become self-sustaining. And then there's the point that was interestingly made in Diane Eck's presentation as part of the Hindu tradition, that we ought to give to strangers. I think that we ought to give to strangers. I don't think that we ought to fail to take any interest in the impact of our giving, because I think it's important that our giving be effective. Perhaps in contrast to that tradition, I don't think we ought to give to purify our own conscience, although it may enhance our self-esteem if we give, and that's great. We need all the incentives that we can get. But I think we ought to give because we want to help people, because we want to make people better off, and we want to make people better off in the long run. And so we ought to follow through what we're doing. But I do think we ought to give to people we don't know. I think we ought to give where our money does the most good. And if we're living in an affluent part of the world, then it's overwhelmingly probable that our money will do the most good if we give to those in other countries who are far poorer than us and who lack the social security that people in our country have. I'm not saying social security in the United States is comprehensive or as good as it should be. It's certainly not. But nevertheless, it is true that people in the United States, as I said, can get safe drinking water. People in other parts of the world can't. They have sanitation. They do have access, if they're poor, to some medical care, if they turn up the emergency rooms of hospitals, or they may have access through Medicaid programs. They can get food stamps. Although it's tough to be poor in the United States, and I don't want to minimize how tough it is, I think it's tougher still. And I think your dollars go a lot further because of the different purchasing power of your dollars in other countries. So I do think that we ought to be giving to strangers and not only to those who are around us. So you might ask, how much ought we to be giving? That's a difficult question. On the website that I mentioned, I'll come to again in a moment, I suggest a progressive table. Some of the religious traditions that we've heard about today, certainly the Jewish and Christian traditions, talk about tithing, about giving 10% of your income. But should somebody who is earning $1 million a year be giving the same percentage as somebody who's earning $30,000 a year? I think the answer is no. I think, as with progressive tax scales, we ought to be giving more as we earn more. And what I've done on this website, which might as well show you there, thelifeyoucansave.com, what I've done is to suggest a table of giving. If you go to, there's a thing there that says the pledge on the top line. I don't know if you can see that from where you're sitting. It will suggest pledging to give a certain percentage according to your income. And the idea is that it's so calibrated that it's not a severe hardship to anyone. It's still, I would say, in keeping with the rule of easy rescue, that you don't have to really seriously blight your life prospects in giving at this level. On the other hand, it's substantial enough so that if the affluent people of the world were to give at those levels, we would have multiplied by many times the total amount of aid in the world. And if that were done directed effectively to organizations that can handle it, and I'm not saying that's simple, because even with those organizations that are recommended by GiveWell, no doubt if you gave them $1 billion tomorrow, they would scratch their heads and say, gee, we didn't expect to get that. What are we going to do with that right now? So you do have to, there's a lot of thought and care that needs to go into that, but I think it would be reasonable to say that we could virtually eliminate global poverty. That is, we could shrink it from the over 1 billion people that the World Bank says are now living in extreme poverty to pockets of extreme poverty in countries where there was a civil war going on, perhaps, or there was an immediate humanitarian crisis of some other kind, and to individuals who, as in wealthy societies, we have individuals who somehow fall through the cracks. So I'm not saying we can ever eliminate extreme poverty altogether, but I do think with relatively modest amounts from the majority of individuals in wealthy countries, we could make the mass extreme poverty that we have today and the 8 million child deaths that we have today a thing of the past. And I do believe that, if, as I hope, we are on a path of moral improvement in general, and on that question, I'd recommend Steven Pinker's recent book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. If he's right about that, then I think in future generations people will wonder how it was that we sat so comfortably in wealthy countries while allowing so many children to die preventable deaths in other countries. Thank you.
Well, our various speakers have given us the gift of being relatively well-disciplined in keeping to their time. So that means we have some real time for discussion. What you should do is come up, and there are microphones on both sides if you have questions for any of the speakers that you want to relate. Okay.
Hi, is this
Yes.
on? Yes.
Maybe you give your name.
Sure.
And
Sure. I'm Joanna. I work in communications for a large homeless services agency in the city.
Your what?
Homeless services agency in the city is where I am. I'm giving context. So I think that Diana X started going there, and Peter Singer definitely touched on it. But I wonder if we make an assumption when we ask what are the foundations, religious or philosophical, for why someone gives, about their wealth. So could we distinguish when we talk about our traditions between whether it is someone who considers themselves wealthy who's giving, or someone who considers themselves poor or lower income? Because I think when you think globally about that, in my tradition, for example, touching on the tithe, I think you would see a huge growth in the Pentecostal and charismatic churches globally, massive growth, and that the primary reason that there's giving there is actually a health and wealth prosperity gospel, and also a question of, if I give, I will receive power. If you go back to neither gold nor silver have I, but what I do have, I give you. In the name of Jesus, stand up and walk. And I think nowadays, if you look at all of those churches all over, especially Africa, Latin America, increasingly China, you see that there is a lot of giving, and it's for these other reasons. And then I think if you look at the wealthy, which then would predominantly be the North, it's fascinating because I don't think it's just the question of the greatest commandment, but I think there's a contention with the Great Commission. And you saw that in the last election. I think there's two camps that says, I give because I'm a believer in the Great Commission, and that actually means that I don't support the government giving. I support my personal giving, and a view that says, no, it's the Great Commandment. And so I guess my question is, how would we change what we thought about how our traditions give if we altered that foundation based on whether that person was in fact poor or whether that person in fact had great wealth to give?
okay, this question seems rather general. So we make a stab at it. You want to say something?
Yes, Brian, you do that.
All right.
Yeah.
Because of my hearing, I'm not positive I got the whole question.
Did you get the question?
The Great Commission, Great Commandment distinction about why people give and how they see things.
And whether they're wealthy or whether they're poor. Does it change why they give?
Well, I mean, I think there's been a long argument within the Christian tradition about private giving versus organized giving through government, for example. That's one thing. And then a second about why you give. My sense of it is that the Christian tradition calls upon people to think, Diana highlighted it from another tradition, calls upon people to think about everything they have under the category of stewardship. That is to say that what we are and what we have is entrusted to us, and then you enter into a whole series of questions about how that stewardship is exercised effectively. There is a principle in Catholic thought, but is reflected in other religious traditions and other Christian traditions, that's called the universal destination of the goods of creation. That is to say that the goods of creation are given to the human family in each age and each time. That doesn't deny that the human family is divided up into nations, cultures, etc. But there is a sense that whether one is thinking personally or whether one is thinking in terms of national wealth, that there is a stewardship function that goes with possession. My sense is that the Great Commandment argues that there is the exercise of stewardship is to be, in a sense, dealt with according to the order of charity, that we have multiple obligations, some of them personal, some of them familial, some of them national, some of them public, in terms of, as we just talked about, responsibility to how we think about what our nation does. So I'm not positive how the argument gets corrupted, if you will, or gets changed. I think there's a standard tradition that I would argue moves from stewardship to some sense of distributive justice, which then gets fulfilled in both private obligations and public obligations in terms of governmental programs, such was just talked about. I don't know whether I've captured what you said.
Did you want to say something, add something to this?
I would just, I think there also was implicit in that a sense that the Gospels, largely coming out of very evangelical health and wealth gospel traditions in the U.S., and some of the Pentecostal communities have grown much more rapidly in other parts of the world. And I don't think that is necessarily because of the sense that wealth is something that you earn because of your faith. I think it's a redefinition of wealth as well. So if you start looking at Pentecostal churches in India or Asia, it's not that we're getting rich because we have become Christian. It also is that we have redefined what we mean by wealth. I think there is some truth in that. The other thing I would say, though, is that part of the resistance to mission, and I have in mind that that's what you were talking about, the resistance to mission and missionaries in some parts of the world, I think of Russia in particular, but there are many others, has to do with the fact that the very missionaries themselves come with huge amounts of persuasive wealth. Television stations and amounts of money that are not really part of the religious traditions of local culture. That poses problems, and some of the kinds of problems that are inherent in notions of coercive proselytism. That proselytism is a structural matter as well when people in poor countries are sort of invaded, you might say, by missionaries with huge amounts of wealth. So there's a disequilibrium there that's very difficult.
Teresa, did you want to ask a question? No, there's a question here, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I have a question. It's about philosophical and religious foundation. I think that there's a common denominator between both traditions, the religious and the secular, in terms of the language of human rights. And everybody comes at these questions from their own perspective, so I feel a slight disconnect, not a big one, between a panel on caring for the needs of strangers, and none of the speakers used the language of human rights, of probably especially strangers, that we are whose needs need to be translated into rights. Now, the child in the pond created, when I saw the kid, an obligation, I guess you called it, or in me, the awareness of a duty to help that child out of the water, never mind my shoes. Can I generalize all of that in terms of the language of human rights? And the reason I'm asking the question is, if I could get my audience to think that these people have rights, the kid has a right. That would strengthen the situation, I think, if I could. So did you omit human rights language by design or just by mistake or what?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's a very interesting one. Speaking personally, I omitted it by design. And I omitted it by design because I think it complicates the argument. Because I'm talking about not things like torture, which we could all agree to be a human rights violation because it's done by, let's say, a particular torturer to a particular victim, and we can easily say you're violating his right. But if we're talking about what is sometimes called the right to sustenance, the right to enough food and basic health care or whatever, clean water to survive, it's a positive right in the language of philosophers. So if you say, if there's a person starving somewhere, and you say he has a right to sustenance, then we have to say, so who has the duty? Who is violating that right? And I guess the answer would have to be all of us. But on the other hand, we don't all want to converge on giving food to this one person. So it becomes a more complicated. Now, I'm not saying that it can't be done. In fact, in my center at the Center for Human Values at Princeton this year, we have visiting fellows each year. We have a scholar from St Andrews University, Elizabeth Ashford, whose project is exactly what you suggested, to develop an argument for a right to sustenance that can avoid some of these complications and objections about questions like, well, who has the obligation, who's violating the right, what ought we to do to stop violating it, and so on. But it is a more complicated discussion. There have been other philosophers who have talked about it in the past, and I wanted to present something that I thought was not going to get into those different, more, if you like, sidelines of trying to discuss what is or is not a human right.
Do others want to respond? Yes.
Well, I probably ought to say that I only admitted it because of time, because if you look at, I closed with the Catholic argument. Catholic argument starts with an assertion of human dignity, argues that it's a mix of rights and duties that you surround each person with. And then, as Professor Singer indicated, then you've got to begin to talk about who's responsible for the fulfillment of rights. And there is a debate about whether real rights are all immunities as opposed to empowerment. So it gets complicated, but the logic of the argument starts with human dignity, moves to human rights, and then talks about societal obligations to fulfill human rights. So it is a familiar theme in the Christian framework, but not only in the Christian framework.
I would just add that from within Muslim tradition, I think one of the core elements and one of the aspects that stands behind this whole system of giving, both obligatory giving and voluntary giving, is the notion of a just claim, haq. And haq means right when most simply translated, but it embeds within it the notion that people who do not have a just claim on the wealth of wealthier members of the community, and that is an essential aspect of why zakat exists, of why some portion of wealth owned and earned must be, in fact, given up as a fixed percentage or series of percentages. But that sits at the core of the logic of this system, in fact. And then there are historically very complicated discussions about how it should be implemented and the technicalities of it, but there is that core aspect.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Eric Gregory. I teach in the religion department at Princeton. I guess I wanted to maybe draw together some of the themes to ask in the service of a normative question about comparing and contrasting religious dispositions about giving to modern moral philosophy and especially the social sciences that builds, I think, on the two previous questions. And I was thinking not just about the subway tragedy, but also last week, the hero cop who gave money to the homeless man in New York City. Turns out it's been a much more complicated story, and there's been a kind of suspicion about the so-called undeserving poor and lack of attention maybe to the structural dimensions of poverty. Maybe Peter Singer thinks the $49 spent on the shoes should have been spent elsewhere. So that's the kind of metaphor, the story that's behind this question. And it's really about the professionalization of effective caregiving in modern societies versus some of the religious dispositions of ad hoc, spontaneous compassion that I also heard in Professor Eck's and also in some respect Professor Hare's question. So I think Professor Eck referred to it as a tension, and I wonder if there's something more than a kind of moral argument by modern moral philosophers and social scientists against some of the historical enduring aspects of religious almsgiving. Professor Hare mentioned the symbolic deployment of Jubilee, But biblical scholars tell us Jubilee was in fact never practiced. And developmental economists tell us it would be disastrous for the poor. So it has an imaginative act of claiming all people for God that I think has a kind of cosmopolitan dimension that I would support. But I guess I want to draw you out on how you mentioned principles need to be casuitical to get their force. And it seems like there is some tension between, I think Charles Taylor's new book laments the professionalization of caregiving and the rise of the social sciences as a kind of rationalizing gift giving in the West. All the programs I see outside for degrees you can get in philanthropy as somehow evacuating the kind of spiritual openness that one might find in the Indic traditions or even in some of the Good Samaritan teachings of the Christian tradition, where the concern about consequences that seems so dominant in social sciences is in tension maybe with these religious traditions or maybe even at odds with them. So I know this is a big question, but basically it's the question of being innocent as doves but wise as serpents in our giving, and how the religious traditions, mainly Christianity, but I was really provoked by Professor Eck's discussion about the detachment from knowing what happens to one's gift, or so-called smart aid. It seemed really dramatically contrasting to the secular approach that Peter Singer mentioned. So I thought I would just highlight that because, to my knowledge, most religious institutions today have effectively become professionalized. All the NGOs, Catholic Charities, etc., are using data that someone like Peter Singer would applaud in terms of givingwell.org. But it seems that really at odds with Buddhism, Hinduism, and aspects of Jesus' teaching about giving to the poor.
Thank you. Who's going to take it on?
Well, let me just say, I think you've actually not only asked a question, you've provided a very cogent statement of some of the issues. I mean, I think the reason that I highlighted the things I did from the Indic tradition is that there is an aspect of our own spiritual cultivation, the cultivation of the attitude, the nuanced attitudes of the giver that has to do with something that is more at the root of some of the vast difference between, the chasms between rich and non-rich, or however you want to put it. And that is that generosity and the cultivation of attitudes of mind or attitudes of spirit are really deeply embedded in the ways or implicated, I guess, in the ways in which the very problems we're trying to address have arisen. And that sort of goes beyond simply issues of poverty, however we define that, but also issues of sort of anger and greed and the tendency to retribution, which are real problems in society. So we're talking here about ways in which the giver becomes gradually transformed by the practice of generosity. And of course, generosity is a practice, just as shopping is, is something that's kind of reinforced by the more you do it. And I think that's the point here.
Peter, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a great question, Eric, and it's really interesting because I've been having some discussions with someone. There's a website called 80,000 Hours. 80,000 is the idea of how many hours you're likely to spend in your career. It's a website for people interested in ethical career choice. Now, most people who are thinking about an ethical career think about, well, maybe what I ought to do is work for one of these aid organizations and actually help the poor. So I'll be, it's still professional, I guess, in a way, but it is me directly doing it. This website set up by a guy called Will Crouch actually takes the professionalization back even one step further and says, maybe if you're a graduate from a top university, you will have opportunities to go into investment banking and earn hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and you could give that to an aid organization, and it could then employ 10 aid workers who could do the work that you could do. So, you know, it's encouraging people to think about maximizing their opportunities. But of course, what you lose in that is the sense that I am living a life of caring, because most of your working time, you're living a life of maximizing profits in order to get the big bonus that will enable you to do good in the end. And to how far can we push it? This is the question that I asked. How far can we push the idea of separating ourselves from the feeling that we are actually spontaneously doing good to help people, which I think is, at an emotional level, an important source of what we want to do and the kind of people we want to do.
Along with Professor Singer, I would say you framed a question that cuts across multiple issues. I must say my approach to it is, for lack of a better term, pluralistic. In other words, I don't think there's one answer to this question. I've had a lot of experience with the professionalization of aid through Catholic Charities and the Catholic Relief Services, where I was a policy consultant for them. I think the professionalization, if you look at it in this country, was part and parcel of the church, in the part that I know, the church trying to deal effectively with questions that now have multiple players in them. So the government and the law is involved, and you just can't go off on your own and decide you're going to do it in your own way, because you may, in fact, run into trouble with the law, for example. So there's a danger that you will wipe out, you know, instinctive generosity. I agree. I don't think that's necessarily the case, and therefore I wouldn't use the argument of professionalization against it. I think, secondly, in terms of what happens with different forms of aid, one of the things that strikes me is it is refreshing to hear Professor Singer's case for foreign aid, because the case doesn't get made very often today, and therefore it's a refreshing case. At the same time, it's almost a question to you. I gave my annual lecture on international distributive justice in a class 2 weeks ago, and at Kennedy School, 46% of the students are international, so they're from all over. But the question of foreign aid is such a small slice of what they see in terms of their economic development of their country. So in terms of the massive amounts of money that flow into the South and out of the South through corporate and other financial institutions, I'm glad that there is foreign aid as an expression of public policy. It seems to me it's a small slice. Now, that only relates to your question, Eric, in the sense that I think it's one more dimension of this problem. Some of it's highly structured, some of it's professional, and some of it's personal. And again, to go back again to Professor Singer's presentation, from 46 years of giving homilies in churches, there are two different experiences I've had. Whenever there's a disaster, there's enormous generosity. You take up collection week after week, and you will get response. Then you change the argument to foreign aid, which I think we ought to, and you get a very differentiated response, some of the questions that you raised. So there is a way in which there is a lot of signs of immediate generosity, and then there is complexity when you try and raise some of the issues that need to be raised on a systematic basis. Those two experiences have been part of my life for 4 decades.
If I could just one sentence, that is precisely getting at least critics I know of religious giving, the spontaneous generosity post-Katrina by, say, conservative Christians in America was amazing. Yet attending to the structural aspects seems lacking. And many identify it's the religious motivation that is the source of the problem. It's the religious charity is the gift that keeps on taking, I guess is the way that...
What I'd like to do is just add another aspect, because I think it's an extraordinarily complex question, but it, I think, asks us to think about what are all the parameters that affect the ways in which people give. And you've sort of put a spotlight on a few aspects of it, but I think there's also a very political aspect of it, and one that shifts as we look across the globe from country to country, and that is the extent to which people are actually free to follow their instincts about giving. the cases that I know best within Muslim communities in the United States as compared with Muslim communities in Muslim majority states, I think highlight one aspect of that, and that is that in this country, certainly after September 11th, people felt extremely threatened in their giving and constrained and unable to give. And that then met what I believe is actually a more global trend in giving, which was the trend that says accountability, sustainability, transparency, some of which may actually be a very positive kind of demand of people which is simply to ask, do you know where your money's going? I mean, as the website that Peter Singer put up, do you know where it's going, what it's doing, and how much it's paying for comfy furniture on Park Avenue, and how much it's actually getting to the place where you want it? But I would also, I mean, I see it also in a bigger perspective of just monetization and commodification of knowledge production. I think in different universities we feel the pressure differently to justify thinking about ideas as opposed to inventing stuff that can get sold. And I think that is also one component of this whole larger question which you've asked.
Teresa.
I'm Teresa Ghilarducci. I teach economics here in acrobatics, but my research is on entitlements, a term imposed upon our body of research. So I would like to know, I need help, to talk about this idea of the deserving poor. I appreciate the motives and the ethics around giving to those who deserve it, but how in your traditions do you discuss the power and the oppression of actually the definition of who gets it? Is it just the beseecher, the one who asks, who deserves it? Or how is that dealt with? Thanks.
Well, I think one way it's dealt with, Teresa, is the recognition that poverty, and there are degrees of poverty, that's for sure, but because entitlements is the U.S. system, is a recognition that when you say there's 46 million people poor in the United States, and we have a definition about that, that lays a moral claim on the society as a whole. Now, it tends to get into the language of rights and duties, if you will, because the definition of what constitutes poverty, one way to assess it is to say that if a right is a moral claim to a good that is essential for human dignity, then one can characterize the meaning of poverty when essential claims go unmet. So the first claim is the nature of poverty itself. It lays a moral claim on the wider society. The second point then is, well, how should we address this? And obviously, before the middle of the 20th century in this country, it was almost always addressed through charity, meaning by that the voluntary giving, that almost in the way that Diana talked about, the voluntary giving of some of your resources to help the poor and religion and other challenges. But then the step to arguing that if there is poverty in a society, there's an obligation on a good society to create systematic programs that are designed to establish a fundamental floor beneath which people should not fall because their dignity demands it. I think that's where entitlements come into the picture, and that's where the understanding, the classical understanding of distributive justice was that one of your responsibilities as a citizen was taxation. And so that taxation helps provide systematic approach to addressing those needs that fall below the level of what one might call an essential good to protect human dignity. So it seems to me there's progress in the sense that if you look over a century, you come to at least a consensual view that a society ought to provide systematic assistance, not to whoever raises their hand, but to whoever who qualifies to a rationally defined standard. And then taxation then becomes part of the argument of how you sustain that kind of system. At least that would be my general sense.
If I can just make a brief comment, I mean, I'm not so interested in deserving in some deep moral sense. I'm interested in giving where it will be effective in the long run. So if you had evidence, there's an organization, one of the ones that GiveWell has just rated highly, called Give Directly, which is a new organization that's actually giving cash grants to people in extreme poverty in Kenya at the moment. So, I mean, I think the question for me there is, do people use the money to make a long-term difference, improvement in their lives with measurable outcomes like for the health of their health and their children? Or do they perhaps go gambling with it or buy a lot of alcohol? So if they're buying alcohol, then in that sense, I would say that they're not the kind of people that I would want to give to, because it's not going to make a long-term difference in their lives. Some people might say, in more Victorian English morality, that shows they're not deserving because they had the money and they drank it away. Okay, you can make that moral judgment if you like, but I'm really interested in it because of the consequences.
And let me just say that actually the kind of research that's Erica Bornstein, for example, has done in New Delhi, they're not interested in what it means to be deserving poor. You know, the sadhus who are lined up at the door and some of the widows and elderly people and beggars, you know, that is not the desire of the donor to make that kind of judgment. There is an insistence in the sort of theories of giving that have been developed over the centuries that the recipient be a worthy recipient. But I can tell you very often the worthy recipient, what they mean by that is a Brahmin, a sadhu, a monk, someone who has relinquished claims on the wealth of society and is therefore worthy of the support of people who have wealth. But it's also true that in a karmic society, the notion that what we do has consequences for us, the judgment of who is deserving poor is not something that is made, really.
I think that certainly in Muslim traditions, they're very, I mean, as the categories that I talked about of those who are supposed to receive zakat distributions and also voluntary charity, there's very clearly a sense of who should receive. But the categories are defined extremely broadly, and so if you look at the way they're interpreted then in historical situations versus contemporary situations, you can see that there isn't a hard and fast way, so that in a sense they're stretched more rather than less, and that's, I think, for certain kinds of formal giving, but because this whole world of voluntary giving historically is documented pretty sporadically, if I look at the examples that I know, and I speak mostly as an historian, it seems to me that while formal distributions take care of things on one level, because there is an ethos in the society of giving, that there are any number of ways in which people reach out to neighbors or even to the neighborhood and have then assistance of various kinds, be it food, clothing, or shelter as the most basic ones, which are then extended to people through the households. But even in terms of celebrations on formal occasions, for instance, I mean, in a neighborhood, if a wealthy person were to celebrate the circumcision of his son, which is an extremely important ritual moment, it was the tradition in many places that that person also sponsored the circumcision and celebration for the family then for any number of other boys in the neighborhood whose families would not necessarily have been able to provide a celebration that was deemed really adequate or celebratory in that way. So people, there are lifetime moments, there are annual moments in the calendars where people take the opportunity to do things informally. But I speak also as a lay person and not as a Muslim, so I think that one might ask an imam today how that's handled within the community, how those decisions are made.
My name is Rob Risch. I teach in the political science department at Stanford. I'm a panelist tomorrow. I wanted to ask a question about what I perceive to be a contrast between the philosophical or secular justifications for giving or caring for the needs of strangers and the religious ones that were on offer. Peter's justification focused entirely on the needs of others and presumably leads to an analysis that would eliminate, the desirable outcome is to eliminate the situation or the condition in which there are desperate needs for others through which we might act charitably. Whereas for the religious traditions, I think at least part of some of the things that were brought out here, and at least my hazy understanding about some Judeo-Christian traditions, is that there's a self-regarding nature of the giver from a religious perspective, in that it's part of self-perfection or part of one's relationship with the divine, or simply a religious character virtue to be charitable, which is to say, it's important for you to perform this sort of act for religious reasons without wholly regarding the objective needs of others. So just to put it in a clear way, it seems to be the case that whereas for Peter, there is no reason or obligation for the most desperately poor to perform an act of charity, for the religious believer, who is the poorest, there nevertheless still would be a reason for that person to perform charity, which seems from a secular perspective a bit perverse.
Yeah, I think if you stated it that way, it probably does get perverse. I mean, right down to that's to extend it out to the logical extent of the proposition. I think in at least the tradition, the only tradition I can represent, there is an argument that the development of certain virtues as part of one's life is part and parcel of what it means to flourish as a human being or to grow in holiness. And part of that growth is that you, let me put it for lack of a better term, that you represent in your own life the generosity of God, even if you interpret that in the first instance, the generosity of God to you, but more in principle, a God who is interpreted as generous then sets a standard for what it means to be fully human and holy. On the other hand, I would say the needs of people are what determine the necessity to practice that virtue. So it isn't only a matter of a kind of self-regarding idea of what kind of person I am. It is that those needs place an objective moral demand on others. And I think, again, Professor Singer's argument that we ought to maintain the premise that we give to strangers, the premise behind that in religious terms is that it is a common humanity that we share that is the first fundamental characteristic of our existence. That common humanity places demands upon us when others are in need. And even though then you have to break a complicated world down into states, nations, international institutions, that's why I personally argue for a pluralist mix of governmental policy, international policy, and personal characteristics. But it is the need of the other person that sets the standard for the exercise of the virtue that you ought to have if you're a believer in the kind of God that you say you believe in.
I think that, yes, there's in a belief system, part of the system is about the motivations for doing various things. And one aspect of that motivation is self-reflective. It has to do with who I am. It has to do with what I do in order to both articulate and also externalize in my actions the extent of my belief and my commitment. But I think that one thing that it's important to do in terms of thinking about faith and philosophy, or faith and a non-faith-based way to be in the world, is that believing people have a faith system which shapes them, but it doesn't mean that they are not part of social systems and don't seek to find the ways within their faiths that allow them to act as part of it. So for instance, Judaism says, and I'll wear the hat that you took for a moment because it's my own. Judaism has a number of sayings. I mean, one of the clearest is, I mean, there's a huge sort of charity ethic, a charity, and I use the word without defining it for the moment, but a giving ethic. But there's also a very common phrase which says, Aniei ircha kodmim, the poor of your city first. And it comes in the context of, and then you get farther away. It's also the case in Islam that zakat should first be dispensed within your community, and then if you can't find anybody to fit the categories, go further out. But at the same time, if we look historically at the way things worked, for instance, in medieval Cairo, which is a huge Jewish community and is constantly being bolstered by people coming to it because it was fairly wealthy, we have a whole series of letters which are basically begging letters that people wrote. And they are often, and this is based on the work of Mark Cohen at Princeton University. He worked on these letters, and the letters all talk about the ways in which people positioned themselves relative to the community, saying, yes, I'm from abroad, but actually I'm really close because, you know, I share this and I've been living here. And so you can see that there's a language on the part of the asker and then a willingness on the part of the potential donors to accept these arguments that though you may be strangers, in fact, you're not strangers, and therefore we can include you. So I think that when we look at the lived experience of faith, historically and today, we should see the ways in which people negotiate what seem to be pretty firm boundaries to allow them to act in ways which we might not credit to faith, but which are also the ways that people are motivated to act in their lives. So I would be careful just about drawing the boundaries too strictly.
Hi, thank you for your talks, all very interesting. My name's Eric. I'm a PhD candidate here in philosophy, writing on responsibility, so this has been very interesting today. I think this has been touched on a bit already, but a lot of people you find in the world that are in need of aid, talk louder?
Into the microphone.
Yeah. A lot of people in the world that you find are in need of aid it's a result of structural injustices. Right? And I'm worried about the idea of focusing on individuals giving can distract from those structures that produce those injustices. So I'm just curious about what you want to say there.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I agree that a lot of poverty is the result of structural injustices. I don't think that all of it is. But, for example, you could talk about the global trading arrangements, and there's a lot of debate about whether the World Trade Organization has reduced poverty, as probably has in some instances, helping people to produce goods they can sell in the affluent world, or increased it by essentially flooding markets with products that are produced elsewhere. And there's questions about the effect of agricultural subsidies on making it harder for people to sell their crops into global markets. There's questions about the way we buy minerals and oil from dictators, although we know that none of the money or very little of the money will go back to the citizens of the country as a whole. So there are a lot of things that you could call structural injustices that cause a great deal of poverty. And I do think that we have responsibilities as citizens to try to do something about that. So I think we should support political leaders who want to produce more just global institutions. And if somebody said to me, look, I have a choice between giving to one of the Give Well recommended charities or supporting a political movement that I think is going to succeed in reforming the WTO, well, if there really was some chance of contributing to a movement that would reform the WTO in a way that would reduce global poverty, that would be fine. I would have, no trouble with that. Again, one might say, to go back to Eric Gregory's question, that's a further remove from the spontaneity of giving. But in the world in which we're in, it's a response to injustice. And I think that's really important as well. But it's difficult to know what strategies are going to be effective in that, and in some sense it's a gamble that you're going to be able to make any difference in that area, whereas I think you do know that if you give to the Against Malaria Fund, it's highly probable that you will be able to prevent one or more children from suffering from malaria.
I do think if we take the example of Gandhi's deliberate taking on of the logic of asceticism in relation to very powerful forces, his was really, a very sharp strategic ability to use particular issues of structural injustice to mobilize consciousness and movements. On the very eve of the Salt March, for example, which was about the taxation of salt, which fell much more heavily on the poor and on the laborer in India, he wrote what is now a classic letter to Lord Irwin in New Delhi, basically describing the difference between Lord Irwin's salary and that of the average laborer in India, something like 7,000 times the salary of the laborer, and says to Irwin, well, I'm sure you give it all to charity, but a system that will countenance this kind of disparity needs to be summarily scrapped. And that kind of identification of an issue like salt, for example, was not simply, one could have donated salt to all of the people who became involved in it. That would have been one very effective charity at the time, but actually what that issue did was to galvanize tens of thousands of people over the next few weeks to think about the structural injustice and go and make salt themselves. And I think the Bhutan movement that I mentioned toward the end is another example of looking at a structural issue of who owns the land and who owns the wealth and what their responsibility then is. And his movement to acquire land for the poor through the gift of land was one, you would have to say a religious way, because he was trying to appeal to people's sentiments for justice, but to work on issues that are functionally structural. I'm not sure that this is the most practical way for people to go about social change, but Gandhi had a pretty good way of organizing around issues of strategic importance for many, many people.
I also think that there's different ways to relate charity and justice in normative terms, and one way to argue it is that the meaning of justice is to try to analyze, address, and define the structural issues that produce poverty, and that charity, under that definition, is what individuals and groups do to deal with the consequences of structural injustice. So that charity, in the end, is voluntary and spontaneous, but it's dealing with the consequences, whereas the function of some framework of argument about justice is to define what is structurally wrong and to ask what it would take to address those structural questions.
Thank you. We have time for a few more questions, but then we will have to stop. So, okay?
I'll make this brief because it was actually addressed by a few other questions, and it's mainly for Amy Singer. Do you think that the dominance of compassion and zakat in Islam undermines the ability for the religion and religious people to think about aid in different ways, such as a rights-based approach or a more justice-based approach? Because I'm from Turkey, and a lot of people in Turkey, including the government, think about it from that point of view. And even though you said haqq is one of the bases that is discussed in the Quran, not a lot of people know about it. So when it comes to poverty alleviation, it doesn't actually, it's not very effective because of the dominance of compassion and perhaps even pitying people who need money and therefore fulfilling a religious obligation to give to them, but that doesn't address the problems effectively.
I'm going to give you a very short answer, just because, partly because of time, partly because we're going a little bit beyond what I do know about, but I know something about Turkey. First of all, I wouldn't presume to make assumptions about Islam globally in responding to your question. And since you bring the case of Turkey, I would respond to Turkey as one particular expression in today's world. Turkey, as far as I've read, and the work of Aisha Bura, who has written about this, I think most closely, points in part to just the lack of any development of a sort of social welfare, social services tradition in the modern Turkish state, in the list of things that were developed in the, after 1923. And certainly one would not presume that it was a self-consciously Muslim ethic which was driving the decisions made by the Turkish government at that point, but one could discuss how much and how little in fact was present. But I think that one of the interesting things globally is to look at the very, very different ways that contemporary states that characterize themselves as Muslim have structured social welfare organizations, have structured the way they address issues of rights, of poverty, of what deservedness is in their own countries. And then I think in the last 20 years or so, the emergence of big transnational Muslim agencies, which I think part of their premise is that people have basic rights. I think that that's kind of a fundamental assumption in the construction of such organizations, that people have basic rights that we're not addressing. So I think it's a very different response if we're looking at the way a national government sets things up and perhaps the way a transnational organization or a communal organization are structured, because a government is constrained by a whole bunch of other parameters, geographical and political and whatever, whereas transnational movements and local communal movements kind of operate either above them or below them, and so have self-defined themselves according to the particular purpose they've chosen to address, which can be then sustenance, education, whatever. But I think that...
What about individuals' point of view?
I don't have a basis from which to answer on behalf of hundreds of thousands, millions of individuals. I really don't. I'm sorry, but I think that that's something you could begin to read. You could read and ask about, because there's certainly enough literature now about contemporary Muslim ethics.
Thank you. Could we take the next two questions together, because we're running out of time, and hope that the...
Let's get them all three. Yeah.
Well, the next three questions, I'm sorry. The next four questions?
Three.
Well, if you make these
with
questions, it's three, and you have to make them short, and we have to ask the panelists to answer them briefly. Okay. So let's start with the young lady on the right.
Thank you. My name is Linda Feldstein. I'm a graduate of NYU's Hyman Center for Philanthropy. And this is a quick question. Can you speak to giving outside the context of tangible resources in comparison to giving in the context of action? Because I think all of the panelists spoke about giving of something, but not necessarily action-based. And the second part to that, which is very quick, is who does it empower? Does it empower the giver, or does it empower the recipient?
Thank you. Could you?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah?
Yeah, all three.
Quick.
Hey, Tim Riley. My question is directed to Mr. Singer. The first thing I noticed about this conference was that it was called Caring for the Needs of Strangers as opposed to caring for the needs of others. Mr. Singer seemed to make an argument based on a metaphor that showed us to not concern ourselves with the strange because of more base impulses, base materialism in your case. I just want to make a parallel metaphor.
Question.
Yeah, the question is, can there be an argument, can we think about a more charitable account as to why people prefer to help their own? It seems to be a common strand throughout the religions. And a theory being we like to do good when we think we can foresee how it's going to do good. And don't we have that most intact in situations where we know something about those around us?
Thank you.
Patricia Rosenfield from the field of philanthropy and social and economic development. And I'm delighted at the way the conversation has emerged to really get at the crux of philanthropy. And I wanted to ask if there was the possibility of elaborating on the religious understanding of philanthropy, particularly what Brian talked about in terms of the prophetic tradition, what Amy talked about in terms of the Wak tradition, and what Diana talked about in terms of the Gandhian drawing on early traditions, and then Peter's talking about the individual giving to bring it all home to the concept, which is actually being promoted by the Aga Khan Foundation, of community philanthropy, because it isn't focusing on needs, which makes people victims, but really the opportunities to build for sustainable change at the local level and go to scale from that local up in partnership with others. So my concern is by continuing to focus on individual and not communal needs, we might actually just be perpetuating poverty, perpetuating those needs, and perpetuating the concept of victimhood. And I'm wondering how it's possible to draw on these more institutional, structural, not just injustice, but just structural institutional dimensions of religious traditions to build for just and lasting change.
Thank you. This is the very last.
Yes, I'm Nargis Virani. I teach Arabic and Islamic studies here at the new school, and I think the last two comments and questions essentially cover what I wanted to bring up was the non-tangible aspect of this, because when we talk about monetarization, we are talking about things that are modern in terms of what one is able to give, but also this whole question about what can the poor give, and the whole idea of that being a perverse sort of percentage-wise, the whole idea of much to give, and I know the Muslim tradition as best as I can, is this whole idea of the kind word, of the kind time and knowledge. And it's interesting that the last speaker brings up the Aga Khan Foundation, because there again, in the last 5 years, one of the things that has been emphasized is more than money, in fact, the time and knowledge, that there is an imbalance of knowledge-producing societies of the North and needing that knowledge in the South. And so it's not always about the money, and how do you bring up that element of it. Thank you.
Okay, that's a lot to do, but let's try. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to start
brief
really
answers.
Very briefly. I think that something that speaks to all of these is the notion that giving historically grew, I believe, from a social need. And thus, one way to look at all kinds of giving is that it was insurance policies in the most tangible sense, and the most basic economic sense. That is, I gave because I might need one day. And I think 200 years ago, people had much more of a sense of today I'm a giver, tomorrow I'm going to be a recipient. And so you live with both potentials. And I think that if we think of today's world as struggling with the paradox of maintaining community as a focus and as a structure of identity, while also living in a global transnational world and trying to figure out how to be good world citizens, that tension, I think, speaks to a lot of the imbalances that you've pointed out, and the need to have both material but also then non-material forms of giving and forms of cohesion within communities. The difference being that now we have a much wider range of choices of how we define our community and who we are in the world.
Diane?
Yes, I'll pick up on that, the who we are, because the thing that I'm most interested in at the moment is what this kind of conference can produce. Because in the United States, of course, today, because of our new immigration, especially post-65 immigration, we, the people of the United States, have people from all of these religious traditions, Muslims who are about the business of creating forms of Muslim giving in our society, Hindus who, by the way, according to the Pew research released this last summer, are far and away the richest and most well-educated group in the United States. That may come as a shock to some of you who are Jewish, because you've always been in that position, but now it's the Hindus who are in that position. And other religious and non-religious communities in a society that Tocqueville always described as just animated by the energies of kind of the free exercise of religion, the kind of capitalism of religion here, a consumerism of choice. And I think it's very interesting to think about what traditions of giving will emerge in a society that is so multi-religious and secular and non-religious in its energies of charity. This is going to be a very interesting future for us, and I think we've just started down this road.
Peter?
Yes, thank you. A lot of interesting questions, and obviously can't give them really time. Resources, tangible resources versus action, I think it depends on your personal situation, what your skills are, but for most of us, you know, I think giving money is really the most effective way. Unfortunately, it's regrettable that we can't be more hands-on, but I think that is our situation. I was asked about a charitable account of why people prefer to help their own. Look, here I'm really going to appeal to evolutionary psychology. I think it really does explain it. You know, we are just the kinds of creatures that evolved because our ancestors helped their kin. And there are good genetic explanations of that, and I think that lies behind it. I'm not saying it doesn't get all sorts of cultural forms that reinforce it or modify it in various ways. Of course it does, but I think the basic biology explains quite well the circles, expanding outward circles of kin that we have. Community versus individuals. Look, I think, you know, there's this line in Kipling in the Mowgli stories about the strength of the wolf is the pack and the strength of the pack is the wolf. I think you've got to have healthy, strong individuals, and if they're all suffering from malaria, the community's not going to be that strong. On the other hand, they could be good individuals without safe drinking water, so you need to have the community functioning on that too.
Peter, thank you. Brian, you get the last
Just
words.
to go back to the question about action, Diana and I both know lots of students at Harvard work in the Phillips Brooks program. Very generous, lots of activity. They're not in a position to give a lot of money. I always am apprehensive that the social justice experience of people in college is treated like belonging to crew. That is to say, whenever you leave college, you leave that behind. And my own sense is that the action question needs to be incorporated into their sense of their professional lives, that those students will play lots of different roles in society, and the angle of vision they bring to what it means to be a banker, what it means to be a politician, what it means to be the researcher, what that vision is, will determine the possibility of action in that sense. And the final point about the collaboration among the various religious and secular institutions, I think there's a fair amount of that goes on all the time. It doesn't wipe out the distinctive characteristics of different religious traditions, but it does provide some common ground for activity.
Let me thank the panelists for their wonderful presentations, for the audience as well. This is a really good audience. It may not be as big as I would like it, but it is a very good audience. And I also want to invite you to the next session, which starts quite quickly at 1:45 on the psychology and neuroscience of giving or altruism, generosity.